Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Martin Heidegger's essay, What is Metaphysics, contains some very difficult but very rewarding portions and passages and transitions. One of those has to do with this ongoing discussion, which is centered in one part and will show up a little bit later, about which really has the fundamental priority, the negation or the not, or the nothing. And one way that people have traditionally made sense of this nothing, whatever the nothing happens to be or not be, is to think of it as fundamentally dependent upon an act of the intellect, an act of our faculty of thought, our highest faculty that carries out all of these processes for us. And Heidegger will ask us this question during the part that he's calling the elaboration of the question. Do not the not negatedness and thereby negation too represent the higher determination under which the nothing falls as a particular kind of negated matter? That is a fundamental question, a very important way of looking at things. And it's tied in with this formula that he's going to come back to as the nothing is, or nothing is, the complete negation of the totality of beings. And so is this going to be the way that we're going to look at it? Because if that's the case, then there really is a priority. First, we have the intellect and its workings, and we have the positivity of being, and then we take that and we strip things away from it. We abstract, we negate. And through that activity, we arrive at this blank, featureless nothing. Or could it be that things are actually the other way, which is what Heidegger himself is going to advocate and suggest to us is the reality of our existence. So he's going to go on, actually, there we go, and tell us, here we go, are negation and the not given only because the nothing is given? That hasn't been decided at that point in the inquiry. It has not even been raised expressly as a question. We assert, this is Heidegger, that the nothing is more original than the not and negation. Now, asserting is not the same thing as demonstrating or providing a reasoning for or an account for, and that is what he's going to do later on in the work. But he's telling us this is something that we have all too often taken for granted and not engaged in, not examined, not gone to the root of. So let's see how we actually would get the nothing from negation is what he's telling us. So he goes on and he says, we should not let ourselves be misled by the formal impossibility of the question of the nothing. If we pose the question in spite of this, we must at least satisfy what remains the basic demand for any advancing of every question. If the nothing itself is to be questioned as we have been questioning it, then it must be given beforehand. We must be able to encounter it. And the question then is, do we encounter the nothing? We certainly talk about it. It's there in our speech. Is that just an inaccurate way of talking on our part, a carelessness, that a truly scientific attitude towards not only language but beings would eliminate? and traces back ultimately to this activity of negation? That remains to be seen. So he says, where are we going to seek the nothing? Where will we find it? In order to find something, must we already not know in general it is there? He says, indeed. And first and for the most part, man can seek only when he's anticipated the being at hand of what he's looking for. Now, the nothing is what we're seeking. Is there ultimately such a thing as a search without that anticipation? So he says, well, whatever we do make of it, we do know the nothing, if only as a word we rattle off every day. So what is it? Well, we begin with this definition, the complete negation of the totality of beings. And he says, okay, so what does this mean for us? How do we wrap our heads around this definition? This is actually a good digression to make. Lots of people love to give definitions and talk about beginning from a definition. Webster's dictionary defines blah, 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 blah. That's only meaningful if the definition allows us to actually wrap our heads around or to encounter the beings that are being defined in there. If it's a good definition, if it's something more than just, a bunch of words strung together or somebody's proposed idea of what this is, many definitions are actually quite garbage. That's something to keep in mind. What about this definition? Is this going to be valuable for us? How do we encounter a complete totality of beings? How do we encounter beings to begin with? That's worth dwelling on. Heidegger's not going to dwell on that much here, although he does in other places. How do we run into the totality? Heidegger says that the totality of beings must be given in advance to be able to prey straight away to negation, in which the nothing itself would be manifest. How are we, who are essentially finite, to make the whole of beings totally penetrable in itself and also for us? He says, well, we can imagine, we can think the whole of beings in an idea and then negate what we've imagined in our thought. We can sort of bring the totality of beings into the limited space of our head and then put a big not sign through that. Or we can do the sort of process of saying, not this, not this, not this, not this, not this, not this, and then just put ... ad infinitum after that. That's merely in thought. That's carrying things out by ways of ideas, but does that really negate the totality of being? No. And he says, in this way we do attain the formal concept of the imagined nothing, but we never attain the nothing itself. We get something out of that. We don't get what we are looking for. And he says the nothing is nothing, and if the nothing represents total indistinguishability, no distinction can obtain between the imagined and the proper nothing. And even this proper nothing, if we engage in talking about the proper nothing, aren't we forgetting the fact that nothing is not something? It can't be treated as a something. It's no being. We haven't grasped the nothing yet. So he goes on and he says, one way in which we're going to do this is through mood. And we'll talk about that separately in a different video. A little bit later on in the section, the response to the question, he's going to tell us that it's really the opposite way. We've been wrong in thinking that the nothing was radically dependent upon the intellect and its operation of negating. Instead, its negation and the not is going to be dependent upon and arise from the nothing. And there will be a whole interesting, complicated picture here in Heidegger's depiction of how this takes place. But we should mention just a few things from this. He tells us that the not does not originate through negation. Rather, negation is grounded in the not, and the not springs from the nihilation of the nothing, the nothinging of the nothing, the way nothing does whatever, or the way nothing exerts its attraction upon being. And then he says this is actually only one way of nihilating, of nothinging. And so this means that nothing is the origin of negation, not vice versa. And this also means, this is a corollary for the intellect. He says, if the power of the intellect in the field of inquiry into the nothing and into being is thus shattered, then the destiny of the reign of logic in philosophy is thereby decided. The idea of logic itself disintegrates in the turbulence of a more original questioning. Now, if at this point in hearing all of this discussion, you're a little bit lost, you can always go back and re-watch the video and of course, reread Heidegger's text. But you ought to have some sort of feeling of perhaps something like vertigo or confusion in hearing this. It's difficult to wrap our head, even though we have a word, nothing, nihil, rien, nichts, whatever else you want to say in languages. We have this word, but grasping what the nothing actually is turns out to be much more difficult, but opens the path to a grasp of what is actually occurring in negation, in the use of the not.